Hello there. Good to see everyone today. This morning, I conducted a little test with my kids. I found a website that has a bunch of little sound files, a bunch of them in a row that are like 2 seconds long, and they're just playing different frequencies, like 10 kilohertz, 12, 14, 16, 18, whatever. And the test is a hearing test to see at which frequency you are no longer able to hear the things, the sound files. And I gotta say, I was a little bit disappointed in my performance there. My kids were hearing stuff way long after I couldn't hear anything anymore. Like, I didn't get much past 12 there. So, but they kept going and they could hear, you know, around 16 or 17 kilohertz and I had no business hearing that. I couldn't hear anything close to that. So, um, and I did that test because I had come across an article about this thing that's called mosquito box. And a mosquito box is something that, for instance, a gas station will put outside the building there, and it plays a really high frequency, loud and annoying. And the only people that can hear this frequency are younger people with better ears and better hearing. And it's designed to keep people from loitering, and we all know who does that. It's the young people, right? So they play this box. It was invented in 2005, and they'll play this frequency, and it will deter the young people from loitering. And then I don't know if this still happens, but someone was able to make a ringtone on their cell phone out of this. It's called a mosquito tone, I think, or something like that. And kids started using it, like high school kids in class, and they'll set their ringtone and their text message sound and whatever to this noise that their teacher couldn't even hear, but all of them could hear it when their phones are going off. And so it was like a secret way for them to still be able to hear their cell phones, and the teacher, if as long as they're older than 25 or whatever, wouldn't be able to hear it. So those were kind of interesting explorations about hearing and not hearing. That's kind of what our lesson is about today. One of the things I say to my kids, if I'm calling out to them 1, 2, 3 times, Josiah, Simeon, Hazel, where are you? And they don't hear, and I got something important I'm trying to say to them. I'll be like, oh, fine, and I go and try to find them wherever they are. And usually I'll find them with their headphones on or something, or they're just in a really loud, obnoxious environment, and they can't hear what I'm saying. And I'll say to them, if you can't hear me, then you're doing something wrong, right? You should be able to hear your parents. Now, is that true 100% of the time? No, we all know that. But I think it's a good principle and policy. Like, you should be able to hear your parents when they're calling out to you, when they're trying to communicate to you most of the time. And that's kind of what our text is about today. It's about hearing and not hearing. It's about, sometimes we want to hear, but we can't. Like, I wanted to hear the tones my kids could hear today, the frequencies, but I'm not in a position to do that right now. I would like to. But sometimes you can hear and you don't want to also. So that's part of the message today too. That message comes from 1 Samuel chapter 3. It's the text we read this morning. Now, the book is called Samuel, as you know. So Samuel is the main character. It's a story about Samuel as a young boy. But there's also something really interesting that happens with Eli, the priest, in this text. You remember Samuel was born to Hannah, and Hannah desperately prayed for so long, and because she never could have a child, and she wanted one. She said, Lord, if you ever bless me with a child, I will dedicate this child to you. And the Lord heard that prayer, and and blessed her, and because of her faithfulness and her dedication and her character, the Lord says, "Okay, here, I will bless you with this son." And she, as soon as Samuel's old enough to, you know, do stuff on his own a little bit, she brings him to the temple, to Eli, the priest, and says, "This child belongs to the Lord. I dedicate him to him. Would you please look after him, raise him up in the temple in the ways of the Lord, ministering, helping in the temple." And so that's what he did. And when Samuel was a boy, the text says in 1 Samuel chapter 3 that he was ministering to the Lord. So he's part of the ministry of this temple. This is the temple at Shiloh, by the way. Shiloh, what should be called the first temple, right? Before the temple in Jerusalem, there was a temple in Shiloh. That's where Eli and his sons are ministering here. So the boy Samuel in verse 1 was ministering to the Lord before Eli. And that day, that time, the word from the Lord was rare. Visions were infrequent. So if you can imagine this, the text says Samuel's ministering to the Lord, but people aren't really hearing from God that much. People aren't really seeing God, receiving messages from God, in communication with God in these days. No one was hearing from God. And yet Samuel and Eli are trying to faithfully minister to the Lord, who is unseen and unheard. And nobody knows how long it's been. But you can imagine Eli's ministry, like, this is his priesthood, and he's maybe never heard from God, maybe never had a vision from God, and maybe never heard the voice of the Lord. Certainly his kids, who are not very good at being priests or very good at being people. And you can read about that story in chapter 2. But these guys were really bad. They did some really horrible things to dishonor God, to dishonor themselves, to dishonor other people. And Eli is going to take the heat for that in this text. And so they probably never heard from the Lord either. So not much of that happening. And in verse 2 of chapter 3, it happened that at that time, as Eli was lying down in his place, this is at night, and then there's a parenthetical note, now his eyesight had begun to grow dim, and he could not see well. This is just beautiful, beautiful writing and imagery. The text is telling us about Eli's physical sight, but it's really telling us something spiritual, something theological about him as well. His eyesight is parallel to his spiritual sight. Eli, his eyes had grown dim, and he couldn't see. And he wasn't seeing God, and he wasn't hearing from God either. But does that mean that God wasn't there? Does that mean that God wasn't around, wasn't communicating? Verse 3, another beautiful turn of phrase. It says, and the lamp of God had not yet gone out. And that's another thing that's true physically, but also spiritually. You know, it's just talking about the oil lamp in the sanctuary. And this is like towards dawn, towards the end of the night. And, you know, by that time, the oil is almost run out. It's only enough to last the night, and then you don't need it anymore in the day. So the text says the oil hadn't run out yet. Like, it's not quite dawn. It's still a little bit dark out. And Samuel is there sleeping in the presence of the Lord in the sanctuary. Eli is outside the room, outside the sanctuary, the main room there. Okay? But what is that saying? It's saying that God hadn't left or abandoned them. It's saying that God and his light and his presence were still there to be seen, still there to be heard. It had not gone out yet. It just depends on where you place yourself in position in relation to that light. What was Samuel doing? He was sleeping in that light, in the presence of the Lord, in the sanctuary, by the lamp. Eli's place, it says, was outside of that room, and his eyes had grown dim. Samuel in the brightest place in the middle of the night, Eli's eyes growing dim there in the darkness. This is what the text is trying to paint for us, to show us what's happening spiritually in these times. But God was still there. His lamp had not gone out, and Samuel slept in God's light and in God's peace. And here's what happens next. The Lord called to Samuel, and Samuel hears this voice in the middle of the night, or towards the end of the night. He says, "Here I am." Well, he hears a voice, and he thinks it's coming from the other room. He thinks it's Eli. We read this story. He runs to Eli. What's going on? Here I am. Eli said, it's not me. I didn't call you. Go back to bed. That happens 3 different times, right? And after the second one, verse 7 says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord been revealed to him." Isn't that interesting? Like, these people are ministering to God, dedicating their life to God, but they don't yet know God. They don't yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not been revealed to them. It's such a powerful concept, a powerful statement, and a convicting one. Is that possible? Does that still happen? Could I be in that category? Me, myself, as a minister, or us as Christians? Is it possible that I don't yet know the Lord? I mean, it's not talking about, I don't know anything about him. Obviously, he works in the temple. But there isn't the intimate relational communion with the Lord between Samuel and God, between Eli and God. And the word of the Lord, the message that he has for them, has not yet been revealed. Well, in verse 8, the Lord called Samuel again for the 3rd time, and he got up, went to Eli. Eli, kind of rubs his eyes. He's like, wait a second. Could this be? Is this the Lord? This is like what he's been waiting for his whole life. Like, I've been a priest my whole life, never heard from the Lord, never heard a word from the Lord, never had a vision. Nobody has really. But what if this is the Lord? I think it might be. And so he tells Samuel, okay, here's what's happening. You are being called by God. And when this happens again, you need to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel went back to bed, and it happened. And the Lord said, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And then the rest of the story we read a little bit this morning in the text. God does speak to Samuel, and his message is not a positive one. It's one of judgment. It's one that is not easy for Eli, not going to be easy on Eli and his family. It's basically a message for Eli that says your priesthood and your legacy and your lineage is done. Okay? Some people like to blame that on Eli, like, well, if your kids messed up, you must have been a horrible father. I don't know. I'm not doing that. Maybe that is his fault. Maybe it's not. But anyway, his time is up. That's what God's message is. And Samuel, this little boy, being trained by this great old priest, doesn't want to tell him about that. Doesn't want to tell him. But Eli, and I'll tell you this, Eli gets a bad rap in this text a lot, but I really respect Eli. Think of what he is doing here as a man. It's really impressive. We all talk about as Christians, I'm trying to hear God, I'm trying to listen for God's voice, and I want to know, what he's telling me and where he's leading me and all that stuff. Well, sometimes it's not all that comfortable to hear from God. Sometimes what God has to say to me or to you is pretty difficult to take. And Eli knows that message is coming. And Eli could go, Samuel wakes up in the morning and just starts doing his normal duties. He's not going to tell Eli about it. But Eli goes to Samuel and he says, hey, so you got a word from the Lord, huh? Samuel, all he wants to do is say, funny thing, it was really nothing. It was the wrong number. There's no message, That's a joke from my friend Greg, by the way. But Eli says, listen, you got a message from the Lord, and I know it's for me, and I want you to tell me. Samuel says, okay. Well, your priesthood and your legacy and your lineage is over, and God's judgment's coming on you. Eli says, yeah, that's what the Lord says. It's the Lord, Eli says, let him do what he sees as good. Literally in the Hebrew text, this is another play on the words for sight, for seeing. God's the one who sees. I can't see. I'm admitting that as the longtime priest in this temple. My eyes are dim. I know God has a word for me. I want to hear it, no matter how difficult it is. And when I read this text, it's really convicting. I'm like, can I do what Eli does in this text? I know the stories about Samuel, but think about Eli for a second. Would I be willing to do what Eli does in this text? Do I really want to hear what God has to say about my life? Do I want to hear the difficult things that God wants to say to me? Things about maybe my failures or my weaknesses. Things about what need to change. Things, what if it's a message that says something's over? There's an end coming. Maybe, if I got a message that said, your ministry not effective anymore and your time's up, it's over. Do I really want to hear something like that? What about us as a congregation? Do we really want to hear the hard things that God has to say to us? Would we really invite that like Eli does? If he has a message that's hard for us to swallow, to understand, to take in. Messages about our failures, our future. Churches of Christ in general. Do we really want to hear what God has to say? What about our country, Christianity as a whole in the United States or in the West? There are messages that God may have for us about the children that we've fostered over the centuries and what they've done to the ministry and to the work of the Lord. Maybe we don't want to hear those messages about time being up and endings coming. And I don't know if that's a message from God, but it might be. Maybe we're living in a time, maybe you, maybe I, am living in a season where maybe I'm not hearing God's voice. Maybe I'm not hearing what God is trying to say to me. The good or the bad, the easy or the difficult. And when I read this text, I want to be introspective and do a self-checkup and say, does that have anything to do with me? If I'm living in a time where very few people are hearing the word of the Lord, hearing from the Lord, well, is that because my eyes are growing dim? My ears don't work as well? Is that because I've grown older and have poor hearing and eyesight? Even if that's the case, I need to be aware of the fact that just like God does for Eli, even if he isn't communicating with me, maybe because of my own stubbornness or my own attempts to push him out or to stay far away, maybe he's going to give a message to someone else. Maybe God is speaking to someone close to me And God's at work, and his word is there with them. And he comes to them, and they have the message for me from God. What if it's my wife? Because I'm too deaf and blind to see and hear what God is trying to tell me, things that I need to change. What if he gives me that word through my wife, or through one of my friends, through my children? Am I going to hear it? Am I going to be like Eli and say, tell me, what does God have to say? I want to take it. I want to hear it. Or am I going to say, everyone just go do your job. We don't need to talk about God's message for me. Do I want to hear it? That's what we are called to do for one another as brothers and sisters. There are times in my life where I'm totally blind, totally deaf to what God is trying to do in my life. I can list off 400 examples for you right now. It would just be boring for you and embarrassing for me. But there are people in my life that can speak the word of the Lord to me when I can't hear it or see it myself. We all need to be doing that. We need to foster relationships where we can do that for one another. So maybe we're more like Samuel. Maybe God is speaking to me, and we need to be asking, can I hear it? Maybe our heart's in the right place, but we just don't understand the voice of the Lord yet. We've never experienced it. We're not sure how to understand it or hear it. Maybe God is speaking to me. The question is, can I hear it? Am I attuned? Am I attentive? And maybe God is speaking to someone close to me. Do I want to hear it? I want to end on a lighter note today. A poem about hearing God from one of my favorite poets. Her name is Denise Levertov. And this is more in the Samuel category, like, am I paying attention? Am I listening? But there's a little bit of Eli in here too. So I think there's a little bit for everyone. So we'll finish with this poem. Kind of a poem. It's kind of a prayer by Denise Levertov. Lord, not you, it is I who am absent. At first, belief was a joy that I kept in secret, stealing alone into sacred places, a quick glance and away and back, circling. I have long since uttered your name, but now I elude your presence. I stop to think about you, and my mind at once, like a minnow, darts away, darts into the shadows, into gleams that fret unceasing over the rivers purling and passing. Not for 1 second will myself hold still, but wanders anywhere, everywhere it can turn. Not you, it is I who am absent. You are the stream, the fish, the light, the pulsing shadow, you, the unchanging presence, in whom all moves and changes. How can I focus my flickering? How can I perceive at the fountain's heart the sapphire I know is there? Let's stand and sing.